Hi everybody, welcome to today's episode of Azure on Air. We're at the Integrate Summit and it's a great opportunity for me to grab people from our partner network and from the community to come and have a chat about integration. Today I'm joined by Andrew Rivers from 345 Technology. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. Can you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background, please?
Yeah, sure. I've been in software since 2000. Before that, I actually started off as an aeronautical engineer.
Wow.
And one of the things I found frustrating about that job was because designing and building an aircraft took 15 years. And I didn't want to be old and grey before my first thing that I built went live.
Yeah.
And so the whole release cycle thing of software was what really appealed to me.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of transferable skills because I used to write code to do calculations for aircraft systems, and so I just went into writing code. So got into software then, and then by 2004 I was doing BizTalk, and then did that for a long time, and then obviously natural progression into Azure, and here we are today.
So how do you deal with that sort of challenge that our software today crashes and burns all the time, and your aeronautical background means you definitely don't want that to happen?
Well, it's funnily enough, a lot of what we do in terms of, I think one of the things that makes us really successful and different is that we do a lot of platform engineering that makes things reliable, and understanding the fundamental things that make up resilience. Even though the actual technology of, particularly aircraft mechanical stuff versus software is so different, but the mindset is very similar. It's hard to kind of understand that you don't have single points of failure, and that you kind of understand what the reliability of things is, and then you can make the appropriate choices of what the risk is and that sort of thing.
I think it's quite good that actually, because I sort of, just an off the comment sort of little joke there, but actually it really brings me back to, one of the things I've enjoyed watching some of the LinkedIn videos that you do recently, because you talk about a lot of these concepts, don't you, quite a bit. And I guess for anybody watching, definitely go and check out 345 Technologies videos where Andrew goes into some of these sort of challenges like scalability and resilience. So if we transfer that to what you guys do as a day job, what are some of the sort of challenges that you see customers have with integration technologies that we're talking about this week?
Well, one of the biggest challenges that all customers seem to have is often just getting started and knowing, well, there's all this stuff in the cloud, there's all this stuff in Azure, where do I start? Because it's, going and building things in Azure is like going and buying a Lego set, and it's like, well, okay, I've got all these different bricks, how do they bolt together, and how to do that? So we spend a lot of time helping customers with the kind of rapid adoption of putting in a standard footprint. And because we put in a standard footprint repeatably, and we're now productizing that, we might get onto that a little bit more. The other question that everyone always says is, well, how much is that going to cost me? And if you haven't, now we've got a standard footprint, we've got standard bill of materials, standard cost, and that really helps people understand what it is they're getting into, rather than I'm going to go into Azure and I'm going to write a blank check because I don't know what's going to happen. One of the things is just that kind of predictability, and the other side of what we do is understanding, well, how are you going to categorize your applications in terms of business criticality, and then what infrastructure do you need to do that? Do you need cross-regional failover? How are you going to manage your replication, and how are you going to manage state? So a lot of those kind of fundamental platform engineering problems is what we're generally dealing with. This is just me being cynical now, but there's only so many times you can go around the loop of doing the standard integration patterns, and you kind of think, well, okay, I've been there and done that. But actually, some of those core engineering challenges are actually, for me, what I find really interesting, and how we solve those things.
So when you say you're going to productize some of the things that you talked about, what does that really mean then for 345?
So we generally find that customers often spend a lot of time and a lot of money putting in infrastructure, whereas actually what they're looking for is to spend their budget delivering business value of features. I want to connect this system to this system, I want to automate this process. And And then they sort of say, well, why have I spent 3 months putting in infrastructure before I've even done that? And,
Yeah.
and so what we're trying to do is to short circuit that so that we can put in the infrastructure fast. And so our product 345 Air puts in our infrastructure footprint. We can create sandbox environments, dev environments, production environments, but do that in terms of planning and implementation. If we can do that in a week rather than 3 months, then week 2 you're starting to add value to the business, rather than you start this project, you spend a load of money, and then at some point we'll get round to doing a feature. It's like, no, well, let's short circuit all that. Let's get that in quickly.
Because I think that time to value is so important these days, isn't it? You like you say, you can spend a fortune before you see anything, and then especially if sometimes the idea doesn't work out as well, and you want to fail fast and stuff. So when you take the product idea, and because I guess in my head I'm thinking it sounds a little bit like a landing zone, but different in that it's more integration focused, and it's more not just the Azure resources, but maybe the process of how you use them. How do you think that trades off like innovation and flexibility, which is one of the things the product team pitch as being a real big win for logic apps, versus standardization, which kind of takes away from that flexibility? Or do you feel that's not quite the case?
That's a really interesting question, and I think there's a big drive in terms of platform engineering towards the concept of a paved road or a paved path. You use those two terms, which is to enable developers to do the repeatable stuff fast, so they can just concentrate on code. Now, the fact that we've got standard footprints doesn't mean that you're locked into that forever. But what it does mean is that it's always 80-20, isn't it? So 80% of times when that standard palette of components gives you what you need, then you're straight there, and we do that. We can always do custom engineering if that's what you need. It doesn't preclude that, but it means that for all the times when that's not appropriate or that's not needed, then you can just deliver value quickly.
So I guess right tool for the right job again, isn't it? So if we come back to the Integrate Summit this week, what kind of things are you personally looking for at Integrate in terms of sessions? Which ones really appeal to you? What kind of products are you really interested in from Azure?
So the first thing and the main thing for me at Integrate every time is the keynote, because I think the keynote is gives the signpost to everything else. And so we look at the keynote today, and there's some really interesting things coming up with the hybrid deployments. And I'm very interested in that, because obviously some customers are like, oh, I've got all my stuff on-prem, and the logic apps hybrid story has obviously been a long time in the making. But actually I'm really interested in finding out more about that, because I know there are a lot of our customers and a lot of people we know that want to get off BizTalk and all that sort of thing, and for some of them it's like, but I've just got all this stuff on-prem. So why don't I integrate close to where the apps are? And we're starting to get the answers to that now. We know that they've been signposted for a long time, but just getting
realising it.
So it's realising that and making that happen. So I'm really interested in that side.
What do you think about if we take a step back from the tech for a second? It was quite interesting in Slava's keynote when they talk about the size of integration and how what I think he said 2022 it was like 6 billion or something, and it's actually so much bigger than that now is the projection. And then the number of apps and the number of APIs people are building, it's kind of gone through the roof. So that must really validate business choices that you've made for 345 about the importance of the integration landscape based around Microsoft, when obviously there was a lot of uncertainty for years around BizTalk about what the future looked like. It seems really solid, and that there's much more people can do in that space now.
Well, this is right, and I think that certainly with the customers I talk to, they're barely scratching the surface of what's possible with APIs as well. So everyone's building APIs, but that whole governance, discoverability, unified authentication, and getting all these disparate APIs into one technology that can at least make sense of them. I see there's a long way to go before people are really, obviously some are more ahead than others, but there's a massive opportunity to help people there. Because I think one of our customers had 37 applications that were all talking to the same system, the same SaaS endpoint, but they're all doing point to point and all getting the same data. And it's like, well, if you actually had
total cost of ownership.
The total cost of ownership, all the maintenance every time, you've got to change all those different things all the time. And then if you change credentials, and you've got to change that. So the ability to simplify, reduce the total cost of ownership, reduce the maintenance overhead. There's just so many, there's so many possibilities there to, because really one of the things that struck me with doing integration was the ability to simplify. Because when you don't do integration well, and this goes back, even back to BizTalk days, you would just see, you go in places and there'd be a complete mess. The integration included some scheduled task running on some server that no one knew about until you decommissioned that server, and then suddenly everything breaks. Or a bunch of stuff running under SQL agent and then stuff over there. And what we've always been trying to do is bring it all together and then simplify, because that just makes everyone's life easier, and we're still doing that.
Yeah, it's such an important message, that, isn't it? I know, I think projects I've been on where logic apps implemented at one time, and then you may not touch them for 6 months or a year, and then an application changes and you go back to it and you get an opportunity to change it or redo it, and I think a mindset of like continuous simplification and as part of continuous improvement, I think is really what lowers that barrier, isn't it, for a customer, because regardless of what you implement, you always get to the point of how do I maintain this long term, and it constantly simplify and makes that achievable, I think.
And also, when you, again, integration mindset, you've got all these different applications to integrate with, but if you treat each of those as an interface, you only want to do that interface once, and then reuse and reconnect. So as long as you're trying, but as with all things in software, you're always learning as well. You're always learning more. So even though you kind of think you've done a good job first time round, sometimes you come back 6 years or a year later and think, do you know what, I could have done that. And so gradually, as long as you can evolve things and make things continuously better, then
I know. It's a funny side story. Sandro's working on a project at the minute where he's going to be rewriting a logic app I wrote about 5 years ago, and I'm dreading the feedback he's going to give me. But it's done a good job since it was put in. Nobody's really changed it, but I'm sure you do things different over time, wouldn't you? And so when it comes to that managing complexity, what do you think's the trade-off that you find in the real world between, do design patterns help empower you to build simpler solutions, or do you think sometimes they kind of overcomplicate some of those solutions? What do you guys come across?
That's a really good one. And obviously the answer, which is the answer we give in 90% of the time, is it depends. So design patterns are there to help you. I think one of the other things that I try to bear in mind is also kind of an agile approach to things, because when you can see into the future, and that I'm going to need to connect 5 different systems eventually, but right now I've only got to do one. You could say, well, I'll put in this massive pattern and do this, this, and this, and sometimes you've got to balance that against, well, okay, I know that you're going to have to do all that in the future, but right now the job is to do this and this, and sometimes there can be a conversation there to say, well, what's the most important thing? Is to get from here to the next step as fast as possible, or is it to anticipate the future and make that whole thing less painful over 5 years? And very often, very often customers actually say, well, I want you to do something simple now, because we don't know if that second phase of the project is going to happen. So why are we going to go and build out all this stuff for something that might not happen? And so that's always but even though you kind of know, look, you're going to need this. So there's a complexity, simplicity, time to get there.
I guess that's one of the things where the productization of some of the stuff that you guys have done really comes into its own, because a lot of the common things you're going to need, which means instead of that first step of doing it the simplest way you can, because you don't know what's next, but you can actually take advantage of some of them building blocks that you're going to put in. I think it's probably, I've seen that kind of thing happen a few times. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and over time, as you solve more problems, you kind of build in that, you've got more of a toolbox then to build into the product and to sort of say, well, okay, we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, but you've just got more options.
So how do you, I guess, when we think about some of the things we've talked about so far, the big underlying themes about learning is, so you've got all these different technologies, all the design patterns, all the approaches. In 3-4-5 technology, how do you manage the team's skills to make sure people are up to date and they're learning the new things they need to learn and trying stuff out that they may need in 6 months' time? How do you do that organisationally?
We do that in a couple of ways, and a couple of ways that sort of complement each other. So across our whole engineering team, when we go through, because we tend to do an annual and a quarterly planning cycle, and we set objectives for all our guys, as most companies do, and some of those will be, technology or learning things. So people actually have, people have as part of their quarterly objectives, they'll have build a demo for this, demonstrate this technology, demonstrate Gen AI, or pass this exam, or that sort of, whatever it is. So we manage that, but then on top of that, we have a weekly engineering forum. And so part of their objective might be to build a demo on something and then present it in an engineering forum where that's shared across the rest of the team. And not everyone can always make it, so we always record that, and then we've got like a library of those as well. So it is difficult, and I think every company finds it difficult. But when everyone is like heads down on the day job, it's like, how do you balance that across this other stuff? And you just have to eke out an hour a week or something like that.
What kind of things, like from the stuff you're doing in those sessions, what are the things that you think are going to be most applicable in, say, 6 months' time or a year's time, the things customers are going to ask you about that you're sort of thinking about now because you're going to get projects for that in the future?
Again, if you looking at the keynote here and some of the things that have been announced and going into availability, but one of the things we always struggle with, there's always so much. So I think you have to actually curate some of the best opportunities. So API Center, API management, I think is a really big thing. And pulling all that together. There is also, just you cannot get away from AI. And really understanding what that means for our customers, what that means in integration space, what that means in terms of how do we get the training data for AI, how do we incorporate AI models into workflows, how do we use Gen AI to develop faster? Because ultimately, what gives us competitive advantage is, in the past was sort of on knowledge and experience. The fact we've got people with decades and decades of experience, and then just say, well, if as a competitive thing, Gen AI is just like
game changers,
just game changing. But Gen AI plus decades of experience, is actually an amazingly powerful thing. So that's definitely.
I think that's the importance of the learning piece, isn't it? Where there's been these themes in the industry over the last sort of decade or so where there's like a reset point, isn't it? I think AI to me is another reset point where if you're not careful, the 10 years plus experience that you've got kind of really comes down, like reduces in size drastically because actually everybody's new to AI. And I think, hopefully people who come to summits like this, it's kind of keeping your skills on board so you can use what you've learned in the past and apply it to what the new things that are coming out are. And I think that's, for you as an organisation, that's where those learning sort of sessions that you do internally help keep people moving on their journey, which will help customers eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. But the other thing that I'm also quite keen on is the fact that we're stronger as a team than we are as individuals. So everyone can't learn everything. But so we're kind of building up specializations in different people so that as a whole, everyone knows that they can go to the engineering forum and ask a question and someone has got that thing. So spreading that out and being stronger as a whole team is
it's a really
important
great thing. I think we're just coming up to time there, Andrew. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you have a really great week, and if I can just say to any viewers, check out the LinkedIn videos that 345 share. There's some really interesting topics on there. And is there any last things you'd like to say before we wrap up, Andrew?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. But the main thing is it's just ultimately we're quite a small community, and so anyone that's out there that doesn't know us, everyone in integration is friendly, and it's a really friendly place to be.
Yeah.
So by all means, check out Mike and get in touch with him, or get in touch with me. We're always happy to happy to talk to people and be really welcoming.
Yeah, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Bye, thanks, Mike.
Take care.